Want to get started?
Let's do this.
Let's do this. I just want to thank everyone for coming and welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. I'm a professor at Fordham University in New York City. I'm also a proud board member of Fair Fight Action. And Fair Fight Action is a nationally recognized leader and Georgia-based nonprofit that fights for free and fair elections, something we desperately need. They fight against voter suppression, expose anti-voter policies, work to protect and expand voting rights, engage individual voters at a grassroots level, support pro-voter candidates, and convene civic engagement organizations to ensure elections are free and fair because every vote and every voice matters. We're thrilled to have you all here with us for Fair Fight Together. We recognize that for many of us, this moment is fraught with tension and concern, and for some people, downright fear. And in the face of the challenges ahead of us, Fair Fight remains unwavering in its mission, and this series is one of our efforts to bring our community together to support, educate, and motivate each other. And tonight's event is the third of a regular series where we'll gather with our friends, supporters, activists, and advocates, all of those who support an America by and for we the people. We all have more power and agency than we may feel like we do, and together we'll find that path forward. So tonight, my dear friend, Joy-Ann Reid, and I will discuss the path forward together and a more equitable democracy. And this powerful dialogue will inspire action and provide strategies to make a meaningful difference in our collective fight for fair representation. So a few housekeeping items. We received loads of questions. We welcome your questions, but we've already received more than 400 questions ahead of tonight, many of which we'll be posing to our speaker tonight. I've incorporated some in our conversation already in my questions. So if you have questions during the conversation, you can put them in the chat and we'll try our best to address as many as we can. If you're distracted by the chat, you can manually turn it off on your screen, and you can also use closed caption by turning it on at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we'll be sending out a recap of the Zoom, which will include the recording and all the links. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest. Joy-Ann Reid is a New York Times best-selling author, political commentator, and analyst with 30-plus years in the media business. Most recently, for 5 years, she was the host of the two-time NAACP award-winning and Emmy-nominated nightly news analyst program, The Readout, on MSNBC, which I had the pleasure of joining her many nights. Prior to that, she hosted the weekend program AM Joy from 2016 to 2020, which became MSNBC's highest-ever rated weekend program, and a daily news show, The Reid Report, from 2014 to 2015. Reid has written 4 books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, Medgar and Murley, a New York Times #1 bestseller, and The Man Who Sold America, which spent 4 weeks on the list, as well as Fracture, Barack Obama, the Clintons, and the Racial Divide, and We Are the Change We Seek, the speeches of Barack Obama, which she wrote with Washington Post columnist E.J. Dionne, as well as the foreword to Kamala Harris, the official White House photos. She's a 1991 Harvard graduate and a mother of 4, and she and her husband run a documentary film production company, Image Lab Media Group. Thank you so much for being here, Joy. I appreciate you so much for joining us at Fair Fight.
Thank you, Christy. I'm like the only person that doesn't call Christina Christy, so I feel left out. So I'm going to say, "Hey, Christy."
Well, my parents are always like, "That's your, your non-TV name." Can't help it. Can't help it. So, I'm going to jump right in because we have so many folks that want to hear from you. They miss you terribly. You just wrote a piece. Let's open with some of this, and we'll talk about your Substack and just to make sure people know where to find you. But there's been this high level of concern about the current political situation that we're currently in this country. And people are really worried about the erosion of our democratic institutions, from all levels, and our basic rights being taken away. And we've seen sort of people literally being picked up off the street in broad daylight. I'm thinking about the young woman who was a Tufts graduate student, which is my alma mater. And so what's interesting is that a lot of challenges we're now facing as a country, Black women have experienced for a very long time. And as a prominent Black woman who's been in the media for a few decades, what lessons have you learned that could be useful for us as a country as we fight to protect our democracy and our rights in this particular moment?
No, and thank you so much. First of all, thank you to Fair Fight for having me. Always great to be with the great Christina Greer. It's like a role reversal because I'm used to having you on my show and interviewing you.
Are we going to tell the folks? Joy thought that she was interviewing
I
me.
thought I was like, okay, I'm gonna come on, I'm gonna interview Christina Greer. And then they were like, no, no, she's interviewing you. And I was like, say what now? I was like so prepared to do the interviewing. So I'm like, it's a little bit of role reversal. But the thing is that I think about when you just mentioned people being snatched off the street. When I was interviewing Myrlie Evers Williams for Medgar and Murley, she tells this story about how frightening it was to be a Black woman in the South, where any white man or group of white men or gang of white men could snatch you off the street, rape you, leave you for dead, and you knew nothing would happen. Your husband couldn't save you. Your father couldn't save you. You know, this idea that if we're just in married families, that's what Byron Donalds claims before civil rights movement, we were in with
Hmm.
married families. Well, being in a married family didn't save you. There was no one who could save you.
Hmm.
We're now seeing that kind of fear and lack of protection and certitude and safety metastasized outside of where it has always been in this country traditionally, among African Americans, metastasized to immigrants who have views that the regime does not agree with, to anybody brown. If you
Hmm.
are brown, particularly if you're Venezuelan, you are subject to it. If you're Haitian, if you're a Latino, people are being stopped on the street literally because of the color of their skin or their accent and maybe taken. You're seeing attorneys who represent immigrants, even if they're white, taken. We're seeing tourists simply for the crime of coming back from Canada or Mexico, taken, and sometimes in some cases locked up for weeks. That's happened to Germans, it's happened to a Canadian. We're seeing regime behavior that for Black folks is very similar and analogous to the kind of behavior that any white man could commit against us for hundreds of years, that we only saw adjudicated as crimes in the last 70 or 80 years.
Hmm.
And now, rather than celebrate, growing up as a country from the kind of country where that could happen on a regular basis to Black people and honestly to indigenous people as well, we've gone backwards to
Hmm.
say that we're now going to use that same regime behavior on anyone that the regime doesn't like, on anyone
Hmm.
if they don't like your views, they don't like the color of your skin, or they don't like where you came from. It's a pretty frightening development.
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote about it a week and a half ago, where I said Black people are not surprised, I mean, it reminded me of the stories that my grandmother told me from the Deep South about sort of, people deputizing themselves to just, sort of white men deputizing themselves to be law enforcement, and you just never know if you could come home, and so that real fear. And then also, I'm glad you added in indigenous groups and white groups. I mean, don't forget we had Italians and Germans in internment camps with Japanese folks in various places across the country. So this isn't new, but folks are still somehow surprised. And so I want to talk a little bit about your books, plural, because in Medgar and Murley, you talk a lot about the civil rights struggles, and it obviously dovetails in the history of voting rights and the 60th anniversary to secure them for Black people. I just explained to my students about, we're talking about 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment,
Mhm.
and then it's like 19th Amendment with white women and the 26th Amendment with young people. But I was explaining to them that, as a Black woman, we only got really the franchise, not from the 15th, because that was Black men, not from the 19th, because that was white women, but not until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I was like, hey guys, Professor Greer was born in 1978. And it's just so they could understand the math of just how close we are to these strides, right? And how tenuous they are. And so I want you to sort of walk us through how can we draw inspiration, though, from that time and that movement, because you write about it so eloquently in Medgar and Murley. You don't sort of shy away from the brutality and the reality of the situation, but there are a lot of gems that we can take from that particular political moment.
Right. I mean, look, I'm a little older than you. I was born in 1968, and when I was born, even white women could not open a bank account without their father
Mhm.
or husband's signature. When Myrlie Evers Williams became a widow in 1963, she moved ultimately to California about a year later and couldn't open a bank account because she was a woman. And the banker asked, "Well, where is your husband?" And she said, "Well, he happens to be dead." And that's the only way she was able to open a bank account. And I'm talking white women couldn't either. Barbara Walters was an on-air personality personality as one of the few women journalists that were working in the business at the time that Roe v. Wade was overturned. And she would not have been able to open a bank account by herself in 1973 because that didn't happen until 4 years before you were born. So what's
Hmm.
happened is that this country has not actually allowed every citizen in this country to exercise the rights written into the Constitution up until about 70 years ago. That's how long white women have been free. That's how, and as you said, African Americans have not had we needed the enabling legislation of the Civil Rights Act in order to make the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment apply to us. So the reality is these rights are new. The country's 249 years old, but the rights are about 70 years old. And so
Hmm.
you think our parents and our parents' parents and our parents' grandparents had almost no rights. But the thing you can take from it that's inspirational is that despite the lack that our parents and our grandparents had, look how far they managed to get with nothing, with no internet, with no TikTok, with no Instagram, with no email, with none of the organizing tools that we have. So what
Hmm.
we have to really go to is that the things that our parents and grandparents had to do, they had to do without the resources we have. Ida B.
Hmm.
Wells did not have the internet to publish her newspaper. She had to physically publish them and risk getting her place of business blown up, which happened.
Hmm.
So
Several
so so
times.
we need to understand that we are fighting, unfortunately, the same cyclical fight that our parents and grandparents had to fight, but we're fighting it with a lot more resources at our disposal.
Yeah, and I think I am inspired by that, right? Because, the book that I just wrote, How to Build a Democracy, when I'm comparing Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan, and essentially I make the argument if they had a baby 50 years later, it'd be Stacey Abrams, right? Because the thing is, it's like we have this great internal politics with Barbara Jordan working within Congress and, state institutions, but we also had people who were in the streets and the activism of the Medgar Evers and Murray Evers, as you point out very clearly in the book. It's not just the male civil rights icons. It's a lot of women who were doing the heavy lifting as well. So the conditions, though, feel, I think, for some people a little different. Even though we can look at someone like Ronald Reagan, who goes to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the three civil rights workers were, brutally murdered, and that's when he wants to announce, his presidency and some policy legislation. Even though we've had, Republicans in the, say, past 50 years who were less than savory. And like, I feel like we're still unpacking some of the Reagan Bush years as far as what has happened to Black communities and cities and families. The list goes on. For some people, though, this particular administration feels a little different from the republicanism that I think a lot of Black people have been fighting against for the past 50 years. Do you agree with that? And if so, what is the difference?
The difference is this is what Nixon would have been like had he not had enough of a respect for the Constitution to resign. This is the lawlessness of Nixon, the cold calculation and carelessness of Reagan, and the stupidity of George W. Bush, all rolled up into one.
That's
I mean, this
succinct.
is the worst administration we've had. This is Andrew Jackson meets Woodrow Wilson meets Andrew Johnson. This is
Mhm.
all the worst presidents in the world rolled up into a ball, and made fully lawless. I mean, look, you talk about Ronald Reagan. He did that Philadelphia, Mississippi trip 12 years after Dr. King was assassinated.
Mhm.
Time collapses such that we don't understand time anymore. Reagan's reversed the Great Society, LBJ's programs a dozen years after King was dead. That's why he's the president about whom Coretta Scott King, to whom Coretta Scott King was appealing, and who the activism was directed at him because he was president just a dozen years later. That's how short
Mhm.
that time span was.
Mhm. Mhm.
And yet Reagan, who despised the idea of in the 1960s of there being a Medicaid, and Medicare, the expansion of Social Security to include Medicare and the creation of Medicaid for the poor, he was very much against that, though he was supposedly a Christian. As much as he hated that, and as much as he hired someone named John Roberts in his Justice Department who despised the Voting Rights Act, they renewed the Voting Rights Act. George Herbert Walker Bush, he was not super bad on race, but was also again the guy who cut the deal that kept our hostages in Iran longer for Reagan.
Mhm.
So not a great guy who launched a war against Kuwait to get their oil. That guy. He also renewed the Voting Rights Act. George W. Bush, because of whom the person for whom I left politics to try to fight his reelection in 2004. I'm sorry, left journalism to
Mhm.
join campaigns to try to get rid of him in 2004 because of that war, which I also thought was a criminal enterprise full of war crimes. He also renewed the Voting Rights
Mhm.
Act. So the reality is, as bad as those previous presidents were, in the modern era, they all recognized that there were certain red lines that they were not willing to cross. And one of them was openly attempting to strip Black people of their full right to vote. The Republican Party was very nefarious in the things they did to try to restrict access to the ballot. They've been doing that for decades, ever since 65 and the Voting Rights Act. But they weren't so bold as to say, let's get rid of the Voting Rights Act. This
Mhm.
president has reversed everything from the federal ban on segregation. His administration is deleting the existence of Black people, women, and LGBTQ people from history itself. He has appointed people to his government who have histories of open racism, open anti-Semitism, open sexism. His vice president has essentially said women are worthless unless they are married and bearing children. I could go on. Everything
Mhm.
about this administration is noxious, toxic, cruel, and really culminates all of the cruelties of previous administrations into one nightmare, and then adds lawlessness to it.
Mhm.
They do not feel subject to the law. And so when you have all of that happening and you have a political party that's unwilling to stop it and unwilling to even try to curtail it, you have a constitutional crisis. That's where we are now. There is no Justice Department. There effectively are no courts because their rulings cannot be enforced. There's no one to enforce them. And you have an executive branch out of control and a legislative branch that is on its knees. At this
Mhm.
point, it's Harvard we're looking to fight the
Mhm.
regime. That's a
Right.
rough place to be. I went to Harvard. I can tell you that ain't a
Right.
liberal institution.
No, it's not. And none of these institutions are liberal. I mean, I explain this to my students all the time. They're called institutions for a reason, right? I
Right.
tell everybody, I'm like, I went to several HWCUs for my education. It's like they were set up for the production, historically white colleges and universities set up for the production of white knowledge. But here we are. And I think the one piece I agree with and co-sign everything you just said, the one piece that I would add, thinking of my grandmother constantly these days, is shame. If she were here, she would say, these people have no shame.
None.
And you can't negotiate with people who don't have shame.
That's right.
There is, I've always been afraid that, we've talked about this on air and off. I've always been afraid that this will be the selling of parts of this nation, the systemic dismantling, because as you said, when we think about Federalist 51 and the separation of powers and the checks and balances, the courts can say, hey, this is what we actually believe, but they don't have any teeth.
Yeah.
It's like that old joke when, you go to London when they had their billy clubs. It's like, stop, or I'll say, stop again. It's like, and then what? And then what? And then you also have members of Congress who are just like, I'm scared. I'm scared to speak out. I'm looking at you,
Yeah.
Murkowski. And it's like, then get out the way. If you are that scared, then get out the way. So collectively, though, here's the thing. I'm not, I'm worried. Don't get me wrong. And I don't want to be, the drunk lady on the Titanic. But I do, as someone has put in the chat, there is something that feels desperate about these moves. They're swift. It's like a smash and grab.
Yeah.
There are not a lot of adults in the room for sure. And I feel like they recognize it's going to take not just Democrats, but Americans a moment to get themselves together. And when they do, all this is going to curtail itself. Do you feel that, or are you just sort of like, no, this is the season finale? Because I just feel like this is the reboot. This is the reboot, and it's a painful, some might argue, necessary reboot. I'm trying to have a clear head while it reboots itself. Obviously, democracies, this is around the time that they tend to fall off the ledge. But there's something really the cruelty is so palpable. I just, in my heart of hearts, I don't think that the vast majority of Americans want this level of cruelty. People being stopped on the street and, just essentially, you've got brown skin, you're out.
Yeah. And I think you're starting to see, I mean, if you think about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, one of the reasons that even white Americans have rallied around him is that he's a builder. He's a member of the construction workers union. And so the union has rallied around him. People recognize who he is. He's a father, he's a worker. He's not some, person that they can identify as some sort of gang member, grifter who
Hmm.
they think is on welfare, right? That
Hmm.
stereotype that unfortunately too many white Americans
Right.
believe about brown people. But here's what I would say. I would say that the reason for the speed and the violence of what they're doing is that they know most Americans don't want this. They know that most Americans, if they really sat down and thought about it or were polled about each individual item of their agenda, would say absolutely not. Would you like to get rid of the income tax so that the rich pay no income taxes like they did in the 19th century? Most Americans would say absolutely not. Would you like to go back to an industrial economy in which you no longer work in the sciences or have a job working for the National Health Institutes, but you rather work in a factory and your children work in the fields? Would you like to go back to that 19th century industrializing American economy where your only job options are to work in a mill,
Hmm.
or to
Hmm.
make textiles? Do you want to replace the low wage Vietnamese workers who right now make your sweatshirts and the low wage Chinese makers that make your shoes? Do you want to make iPhones? Most Americans would say absolutely not.
Right. Do
But
you want to work in poultry factories in the South?
I mean,
Most would say
literally
no.
during the COVID pandemic, we found out who actually makes our. Remember when the chicken sandwich became really popular
Hmm.
and people were fighting
Hmm.
over it? We
Hmm.
found out that those chicken plucking facilities, which are extremely dangerous, are full of undocumented people because they're the only ones willing to clean up blood off the floor. And some of them were 14 and they were getting
Hmm.
their fingers chopped off in these
Hmm.
disgusting poultry factories. And they're doing this horrible, hard labor, this awful, awful labor, and it's labor that most Americans would never do. There's no amount of, I mean, unless you paid Americans $60, $70 an hour, they're not doing that, and they're not making that. These people are making minimum wage, and so
Hmm.
and so the reality is. Most Americans do not want to return to an industrializing economy, a pre 20th century economy. But there are people who do want that. The 20th century is an anathema to anyone who is super rich. Why? Because the 20th century brought a series of changes that made it less fun to be rich. The first, of course, being Woodrow Wilson signing the income tax. We never had an income tax in America. Prior to 1913, the United States was funded, wait for it, through tariffs. The only other time we had an income tax was briefly during the start of the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln briefly enacted an income tax to pay for the Union cause. That was quickly repealed after the Civil War because Americans hate taxes. We went to war with Britain over
Over
tariffs.
taxes. Hmm.
Tariffs, specifically tariffs, right?
Right.
And so the reality is that the 1913 income tax is an anathema to the super rich. The other anathema was that a fellow rich man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, enacted for the first time a broad set of government policies that brought the working class into a middle class, that created a broad middle class who had opportunities to get a home, for veterans to be able to afford a house, for people to come up out of the factories and farms and go into the cities and have a life where there was an 8-hour workday instead of a 12 or 16-hour workday, to leave the company towns and be able to buy homes in the new thing, the suburbs, to go out away from the clogged, choking factories of the Gilded Age and to live lives that were not equal to the super rich, but equivalent. A life
Hmm.
with a vacation every year, a boat, maybe a second little house, a little
Hmm.
home by the lake. These are things middle class people, and let me be clear, all around the world never had. There was always a feudal relationship between workers and their bosses. Their bosses owned everything, including the house that you lived in. The 20th century was revolutionary. We got labor rights. We ended child labor. We got the right to vote for white women. We eventually got the right to vote for black women. We got women liberated after World War II. White women were liberated into the workforce, were able to get birth control for the first time in the 1970s, open bank accounts, invest on their own. We got gay rights. For the first time, there was an acknowledgement that gay people even existed at all, or that trans people existed at all. This was in the 20th century. It was the miraculous century. That's why it's called the American century. And that was produced not just by Congresses that were, let's be honest, majority Democratic, House and Senate, Democratic supermajorities in the United
Hmm.
States Senate, and Democratic majorities in the House. on top of Democratic presidents who did all the progressive legislation. And one Republican president, Eisenhower, who physically expanded the country through highways, which went through Black communities in many cases, destroying them.
Right.
But the
Hmm.
reality is the 20th century is called the American century for a reason. That century is despised, hated, and anathema to people like Samuel Alito, to people like John Roberts, to people like, believe it or not, Clarence Thomas, who benefited from the 20th century but hates it. The idea of affirmative action, liberalization of immigration, liberalization of rules for the disabled, giving them access, housing for the poor. These things, the rich hate them. And
Hmm.
the rich own those 6 members of the Supreme Court. The rich didn't want us to have Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare. They tried to stop it, but they couldn't. They hate the idea of an empowered middle class, an educated middle class, and a middle class with the full right to vote. And so the problem we're having now is that the people in there know that to repeal the 20th century will be deeply unpopular with everybody in every racial group. So they have to do it fast. They have to smash the 20th century because chipping away at it has not worked for them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Um, and it has to be done swiftly because once it's done, then it's
It's
people
gone.
will sort of soon forget, right? And then it's
Yes.
sort of easier to do it
Especially if
that
you
way.
erase history, Chrissy, especially if you erase the history.
And th
If
and
you
that's not
smash it
new.
and erase,
That's not new, right? Because
no.
I always explain to people, you know, when the part of the reason why I wrote this book, How to Build a Democracy, Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan and Stacey Abrams, is because when I asked people about Fannie Lou Hamer, most people had no idea who she
Yeah.
was. When I asked people about Barbara Jordan, the second Black woman ever elected to US Congress, no idea. Some people know Shirley Chisholm only because she ran for president. She was the first. But I'm like, Barbara Jordan was the second, 4 years later. I wanted to make sure I also put Stacey Abrams in the history books so that because she didn't win, I didn't want her to be erased. But clearly, book banning and erasure is not new because the vast majority of Americans don't know who Medgar Evers was,
No.
let alone Murley, God forbid. But I'm always saying Black history is American history. If you don't know what happened in this country to Black people, you have no idea what happened in this country. And so I think my worry is that, defunding the Department of Education, you're going to have a poor, sick, uneducated populace. What do you do with that? I mean, in France, I'm like, again, not respecting history and sort of global connections. It's like, if you got nothing to eat, poor people, the only thing left to eat is the rich. Do they not get that? Or do they just think we can live on the moon and, be in Mars in our little space shuttles doing whatever shenanigans, or we'll just have such closed communities and arm people to the teeth, we won't actually have to worry about interacting with Americans. Like that's the piece that I'm genuinely, struggling with. It's like you can't have millions upon millions of uneducated, hyper poor people. What are they supposed to do?
Yes, you can. I mean, the unfortunate thing is, yes, you can, because
Okay.
that is Russia. You just described Russia, a
Mhm.
population that is largely rural, hyper religious. Since Vladimir Putin has allowed religion back in, the communists, the czars, got rid of Russia. Got rid of religion. They made Christianity sort of illegal. One of the things that Vladimir Putin has been very smart about is allowing religiosity to come back and
Mhm.
speaking in the name of Christian nationalism. Nayib Bukele does the same thing in El Salvador. He promises safety. The largely rural population in El Salvador loves it because they fear the cities. They feel the cities are dangerous. They fear these gangs for a very good reason. A lot of them are violent. They actually love the fact that he's locking people up. And they're not too particular about who, because they feel I'm being saved by this man. He is our protector. We don't need education. We don't need opportunity. We don't need anything. All we need is him. If you go to Hungary, Viktor Orban has done the same thing. He's dumbed down Hungary. He's ruined education. He's ruined independence and struck so much fear into people and said to them, the only thing you have and the only thing you need is me. My father came from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where when Mobutu Sese Seko took over that country, betraying Patrice Lumumba in the process and taking over, he said to them, "You don't need anything but me. I am the center of your life. I am your religion, and that's all you need." And so he
Hmm.
ruined education in the Congo. He ruined opportunity and struck so much fear into their hearts that even with him dead, the Congo still cannot seem to recover because everyone who followed simply repeated the playbook. Xi Jinping, if you criticize Xi Jinping in China, you might end up in prison or dead. If you criticize Vladimir Putin in Russia, you might end up in prison or dead. I could go on. Of course,
Hmm.
it's possible. Have you ever been to Cuba? You walk
Right.
around and you see a lot of scared people, frightened to talk to the government, talk about the government. If you get them alone, they'll say to you, "How can I get out of here and get to the United States?" But most of them are fully passive, fully passive. They don't fight back. If you instill enough fear in people and you take away their education such that they don't understand what's happening to them, they won't fight you. There were
Hmm.
numerous slave rebellions. They were constant, constant. You know when there were the most rebellions? In the first 50 years of slavery, when you had Africans who knew Africa and who were, in some cases, warriors or kings or princes where they came from, who would rally their fellow Africans once they could figure out their same languages and rebel. And then you had people like Nat Turner. Why was he a leader? Because he was a pastor, meaning he could read the Bible, and therefore he was able to rally people. So they said, well, it's illegal to let them read. The idea was to make it Denmar Vesey, again, a pastor, so they could read. So it's like if you have education, you get rebellion. It triggers rebellion.
Hmm.
So what you do if you want to be a dictator, the way to build a dictatorship is to instill the population with equal amounts of ignorance and fear, such that when Fox tells them that every brown person we are deporting is a member of a gang, and we don't even care, we'll just name different gangs. We'll say
Yeah.
they're MS-13 one minute, next thing you know, we'll say they're Tren de Aragua, but we don't even care which gang. Just know they're brown, they speak Spanish, they're a criminal, they are vermin. That's how you got Germans to hate the Jews that were their literal neighbors and say, no, 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 you thought that was a good person, that was your neighbor. They're actually vermin who are destroying Germany. And Germans sat down for that. Italians sat down for it. Spaniards sat down for it. They all accepted fascism. The French were prepared to do it, but enough people resisted. Enough people in Britain wouldn't allow the king, the
Hmm.
incoming king of England, to let them be fascist. The United States had a literal attempted fascist coup to try to install an American Hitler in the 1930s. That history's been erased, so most people don't know it unless you listen to Rachel Maddow's podcast or read her books or watch her show, where she hipped a lot of people to it. We almost became fascist in the
Hmm.
1930s. Most Americans didn't want to go to war for the Jews. Us,
Right.
why would we die for them? The only way we got in is that the Japanese hit us, and they're like, "Oh, they're foreign, so we'll
Right.
do it, but you got to lock up them Japanese Americans." You see what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah.
Humans are tribal. It's easy to subjugate them. It's easy. It's easy. And so, yes, it can happen here. We can easily be what Russia is. There's nothing stopping us. The only thing stopping us is that we have enough Americans with the education and the access to information that they could stand against it still. There's still enough of them, which is why they're trying to terrify us by saying we're not going to stop at sending this construction worker
Hmm.
to El Salvador. We're going to start sending Americans. We're now
Hmm.
going to name Chris Krebs and said that he committed treason for saying that the election in 2020 wasn't rigged. We're going to target even former Trump officials. Maybe they'll go to Bukele. Bukele's going to
Hmm.
double the size of his prison. The fear is what is designed to stop us from fighting back. And the ignorance that they're forcing on American children means a generation from now, there'll be nobody who even knows enough to fight back.
So I think a lot of people have the question, which is like, so then what should they be doing, right? How does one fight back? I think a lot of people are worried about the SAVE Act, right? And as
Should
it
be.
works its way through, and beyond writing their elected officials, what should they be doing? But I think what advice would you give people who I think a lot of folks, I'm sort of like, look around, get to work. But some people need a step-by-step booklet to help them get on the board. What would you give them as an intro to get off
I
the
would
sidelines and get into it?
Absolutely. I think you can do small things that you can do. Look at how Black people are laying Target out just by not going and shopping there. Medgar Evers would
Hmm.
say, you may not have the wherewithal to march. That may not be in your it may not be your ministry. You may be too afraid to march, or you have your job you might lose if you march. You don't have to march. Just don't shop where they won't treat you with respect. Start with a small thing that is in your capability. Look at Harvard. Harvard, of course, predates the United States by 140 years. Harvard existed 140 years before the American Revolution, and they have a $53 billion endowment. They can withstand a lot of pain. So if you can withstand a lot of pain like Harvard, fight. The fact that they're doing that should encourage people to follow them, follow the leaders who are fighting back. So Harvard, I never thought I'd see the day that I'd be praising Harvard because I was not, and I wasn't happy there. But I'm proud of them. And now, don't be like Columbia and get on your knees.
Hmm.
Get up off your knees. All
Hmm.
these other colleges, the people are forming a compact. The Big Ten conference schools are forming a compact. Get behind them. If that's not in your capability, then say if you have a D9 level kid that is a really great athlete, and they have a choice of going to school at the University of Florida, which is allowing ICE to raid their campuses and take people, say no to them. Send your kid to a school in a state where they are protecting people's rights. Withhold your child's labor from states and schools that are not doing the right thing. You have some time off. Don't take your tourist dollars to places where they're not respecting rights. Florida, Texas, Louisiana. Maybe don't do that. I just found out today that Target is the name sponsor, which is crazy to me, for Essence Fest. Super
Oh, are
disappointing
they
to me.
now?
Super disappointing to me, which is making me rethink whether I'm showing up at that. The
Hmm.
reality is we need to start doing what's in our capability. Not everyone can be a leader or a marcher or have a bullhorn or be, the Joneses, the Tennessee Three. Not everybody can be Justin Jones and Justin Jones and Gloria Johnson and the three of them.
Uh-huh.
You don't have to be that, but you can do just your piece. Your little protest. Anything you do, don't buy from stores that gave to Trump. You found out that Ross and the Marshalls, that group gave to Trump, shop somewhere else.
Right.
Deprive them of your money. If you have a child that got into Harvard versus Columbia, pick Harvard. You see
Hmm.
what I'm saying?
Right.
Start to reward the people who are doing the right thing and fighting back. I think if you can afford to get rid of your Amazon Prime, get rid of it. I
Hmm.
unsubscribed from the Washington Post. They're great journalists there, but I'm not going to pay Jeff Bezos for that. For
Right.
that. And so this is what I'm saying: is do what's in your capability. March if you can. Don't buy Teslas. Deprive them of your money. And then the second thing I would say is there is still a lot of power in the vote as it is left. But as they take our rights away from us to vote, particularly women are going to probably lose their right to vote under the SAVE Act. A lot of women are. Those who still have it need to use that vote to save this country. And it's an appeal we need to make, unfortunately, to white folks
Hmm.
because they're the majority and they're the majority in these red states and they're the ones who vote strongly Republican. So white America needs to have a come to Jesus conversation with your friends and family because they can get us out of this by replacing this Congress, these governors, these recalcitrant Republicans with people who will fight. If you do that, then you can cut and choke the money off from what
Right.
they are doing. You can actually dry their money up if you control Congress.
Well, I mean, because Congress has the power of the purse. And I think we said this as Black women, especially after the first Trump administration. It was like your mom and dad, and I'm saying mom deliberately too, and your brother and your sister, and your uncles and your aunts aren't going to listen to Ivy League educated Black girls they see on TV necessarily. So
At all.
you have to do that heavy lifting at the dining room table. You might have to have some uncomfortable dinners. You might have to sort of just go at it again and one more time because it is, listen, all states are red states, as New York has shown us. We're the
Yeah,
reason why, Congress didn't or the House didn't flip a few
that's
years
right.
ago, right? Because New York gained those four Republican seats. So to me, that there's this heavy lifting that I'm trying to not be so frustrated where it's like this is not a sprint, it is a marathon. And yes, you tried it at a dinner and it didn't go well. You need to go back. You need to do it again, right? Because if we think about the bus boycotts and the counter boycotts in the South that you have written about, obviously, this wasn't like, well, I didn't go to the lunch counter one time and then it
And then I
changed
went
and,
back.
and we're good. We're great. It's like for Lent, I gave up shopping on Amazon and Target. Figure it out, Greer. Go to local spots. I mean, Amazon is so convenient, right? Because
Yes.
with the click of a button, I can send you something really quickly. I don't have to. buy it and package it and wait in line at the post office. And even though I am VP at the post office because I bring them cookies and chocolates, but still, most people are not VIP at the post office, right? And
Right.
so, but that extra time is still is worth it for me because
Yeah.
the richer Jeff Bezos gets, the less
Yeah.
he is inclined to
That's
listen
right.
to people like us. And there are power in boycotts. And listen, Target ain't the only one. And to your initial point, though, our grandparents and our parents didn't have the technology that we had. We can actually go online and see all the places that are supporting this regime. We can
Yep.
see all the corporations that keep giving him money. A lot of them hedge their bets and they'll give to both sides. But I think it is incredibly easy now to find information. We have to be careful about misinformation and disinformation. And
Yes.
that's something I also want to talk to you about because as a journalist, and our good friend Jason Johnson and I always talk about this. We feel like with ESPN, they're replacing a lot of journalists with former athletes. That's not to
Hmm.
say that former athletes don't know what they're talking about, but they're not journalists per se. I
Hmm.
feel like in television and in media, there's been a replacement of a lot of journalists with people who have experience. In academia, we call them, like professors of practice, but they don't have PhDs. And it's like, again, great experience, but there's something I never, when people are like, oh, well, you're a journalist. I'm like, no, I'm not. I actually, like, there's a skill set that journalists have that I technically don't have. So, as a journalist, how do we help ourselves and our loved ones really combat this misinformation and disinformation? Because we have access to so much information these days, but sifting through it is getting much harder for a lot of people to do. So, where
Yeah.
would you tell them to start as a journalist?
Well, I mean, and I have to say that I've lost a lot of the arrogance of the as a journalist theme in the last 10 years because the reality is everybody on TikTok at this point is a journalist.
Mm.
There are
Mhm.
people who are 22 years old TikToking, giving more accurate history and facts than you're getting on some days on CNN or definitely any day and any hour on Fox. And so the reality is it's not so much that journalists are the only people who are able to give us the discernment to what we should know. Because unfortunately, in some cases, people who have the label journal, everyone on Fox is considered a journalist. That means Pete
Mm.
Hegseth. Pete Hegseth used to be considered a journalist. He ain't. People are saying, Megyn Kelly is considered a journalist. She was at some point, I guess, but
Right.
it
Right.
doesn't, there isn't a designation that means anything anymore. And
Hmm.
so we throw that term around really loosely. Tucker Carlson, all these people were considered journalists because they worked at a quote unquote, news organization. So I would set that aside. What I would say is show and prove, right?
Hmm.
Who has given you information that is consistently proven to be correct? Everyone gets things wrong. People are always going to make, even, the top journalists have made mistakes here and
Hmm.
there and have to retract things. But who in your life, in your pool of information, has given you information that is most of the time proved to be right? Listen to them more. Who has most of the time proved to be wrong? Who are RFK Jr. fans who told you to, drink alkaline water and that would stop you from getting COVID. And then the people they told that to passed away. Maybe don't listen to them. You got to
Hmm.
start being a curator in your own life of the information sources that are coming to you. You can't stop your kooky uncle from telling you that all you need is vitamin A to stop the measles. But you know what? You can actually do a little research to show and prove, to test and see if that's true. Trust but verify.
Hmm.
Everyone who's telling you things, whether or not that seems true, and unfortunately, that now includes the government. If RFK Jr., from his platform as our head of HHS, were to say to me tomorrow, this is how you prevent bird flu, I would not believe him as far as I could pick him up and throw him across the room. Your government is now not trustworthy. Your CDC is questionable. Your NIH is questionable. The Justice Department is lying to you every day. Pam Bondi came out and said that the Kilmar Albrego Garcia's family is better off without him, safer without their father in their home. They are not going to tell you the truth. Stop believing institutions will save you. It's one of my biggest criticisms of the Democratic Party. They're so trustworthy of institutions that they keep saying the institutions will save us. No, they won't. No, the courts won't. John Roberts won't. None of them will. And so, what you have to do is start trusting yourself and the people who have told you the truth consistently, whether that person is from The Intercept or the New York Times. Start
Hmm.
opening yourself up to listening to smaller media. Zateo is excellent. ProPublica is excellent. Democracy Now is excellent. There's so many great other sources of information rather than the traditional places you get information, and open yourself up to that. But anything, even I tell you, Google it,
Hmm.
double check my work, double check all of our work.
Right. Well, and I've always, and I've been encouraging a lot more people too. There's a lot of Black media that, independent
Absolutely.
Black journalists, I'm thinking of our friend and colleague,
The
Roland Martin,
Grio,
the Grio, the Root,
the Root,
and joyanreid.com,
Contraband Camp. Look, we love
uh
Contraband Camp.
we do love
Michael
Contraband Camp.
Harriet.
And so, thinking about what you've been writing on joyanreid.com, that's Joy-Ann with no E, read.com. And so I think, as we sort of start to wind down, because I know a lot of folks are just kind of anxious, right?
The
Um,
19th. Somebody called out the 19th.
oh,
Definitely.
yes.
Aaron
Shout out to
Haynes
Erin
and friends.
Haynes. Yeah.
Yes.
She has a great piece actually about Black women. It's like, we are still working. Like, you may not
Yeah.
see us doing, but it's like, we've been working, we're still working.
Yeah.
Relax. But a lot of folks are anxious. Um, and they're anxious about the next 4 years. I mean, it's only been roughly like 100 days, right? I mean, that's the point, right? To just make us so exhausted. Um, what are some action steps that you would give people sort of the best way to invest their time and their effort over the next few years? I have this concept that I've been developing where I call political tithing,
Hmm.
where it's I'm trying to invest in the democracy that I want to see. So if we belong to a religious institution, you tithe to said institution. Well, I want my politics to actually reflect what I want. And so we know so many elected officials have to spend so much time fundraising. They don't
Yeah.
have time to read policy briefs. They don't
Mhm.
have time to actually think about ideas, big picture stuff, because they're too busy in study hall, basically raising dollars, right?
Yeah.
And I tend not to give to New Yorkers only because I got my own podcast where I'm talking smack about them. So I actually contribute to electeds across the country because that's how I first learned about Stacey Abrams, right? When I'm begging all these New Yorkers to support this Black lady running for governor, I was like, she's a once in a generation politician. But I do think that there's so many times I look at senators and I'm like, you should have been cut off as a city council member. But once you're a city council member, you can make it to the House, like to your
Mhm.
state house. And once you're in the state house, that's a launching pad to the House of Representatives. And once you're in the House of Representatives, that's a launching pad to Senate or governor. And all of a sudden, you're in the queue to become president. And I'm like, this never should have happened. $5 a month should have cut you off a long time ago. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my big thing. It's like political tithing. And obviously, I'm with young people. So I'm like, you need to think about running. And then most people are like, I don't want to be president. It's like, neither do I. I don't have crippling daddy issues. So, but there's so many, the state houses have so much power and so much money and they can cut things off. I think we focus a lot on the federal government, but there's still a lot of power in our state houses where a lot of people ignore them. And in New York, you can go to Albany with like 2,000 votes realistically, and you're
Yes.
in charge of billions upon billions of dollars. So,
Absolutely.
how are you preparing and taking care of yourself? I mean, obviously you're writing and we appreciate that, but what are you doing to kind of steady yourself, but also prepare for the next 4 years?
Yeah, I never thought I would be a states' rights person, but at this point,
Here we are,
that's the
girl.
states'
Here we
rights.
are.
And really think about that because, as you said, Christina, you can people get elected with very little money, particularly at the local level, and few votes, not a lot of votes. But what's happened is that political giving has, because of Citizens United, it's become a corporate affair, and so people are giving just insane amounts of money, even in these local races. And unless you're AOC, who has a donor base that's regular people, which is why she's so unbought and unbossed, the rest of them are bought and bossed. A
Mhm,
lot of them are bought and bossed, and there are a
mhm,
lot of ideological organizations that pump money into their campaigns, and they want something in return.
mhm,
Our money in politics situation is really gross, and it's part of what's led us to this point of emerging fascism, unfortunately. What I would suggest that people do, and what I do a lot, writing is my therapy. So I love to write, and writing the daily Substack now that because I'm no longer at a corporate entity, I'm allowed to have a Substack, and so I love it. And I use it as part of my therapy because it gives me a chance to read in and also to write my feelings, which is good. And if you can all do that. I think you should read a lot of history, so that you feel so that we're not alone. Know that
mhm,
this history that we're going through right now has been experienced by people all over the Americas. I know Americans don't like to think of ourselves as a part of the Americas. We think we're part of Europe. We're not. We're much more analogous to Argentina, or El Salvador or Venezuela or any of the countries in our hemisphere, Brazil. We're much more like them because they have a similar history of enslavement, colonialism, and settler colonialism. We have the very similar history to them. And so if you have a similar settler colonial history, Canada, Mexico, the Americas, we're like them. So if you look to the countries here, the Bolsonaro experience is our experience now. The Maduro experience in Venezuela is our experience now. The experience of Nayib Bukele, who weirdly enough is Palestinian, which freaks me out that he's Palestinian. He's part Palestinian.
I did not know that.
Yeah, his background is part Palestinian. But their experience, what they're going through, is what we're going through. Read about that. But if you want to read about Europe, read about Poland and Hungary, who experienced a version of what Trump is doing to us, or Austria, or Germany and Spain and Italy in the 1930s, which is literally the same thing we're going through. This is not new. If you want a country that's very similar to us but in reverse, it's South Africa. South Africa started around when we did. The settler colonizers arrived there around when they arrived here, and they colonized the place, and it was just in reverse. They were the 15%, and the vast majority of the people there were Black indigenous people. And they enslaved them where they were. And then they brought in Malaysians and people from India and enslaved them. That's how Gandhi and his family got there. They had a very similar trajectory, and it took them 30 additional years beyond it took on us to get rid of their version of Jim Crow, which was called apartheid. And when they did in 1990, people like Elon Musk's family, who had gone from Canada to South Africa because they liked the idea of apartheid, because they were pro-Nazi, they left. You had 500,000 people exit South Africa, and some went to New Zealand, some went to Australia, some went to Europe, and some came here. And it was an exodus because they didn't have their oppression game to play anymore, at least not economically, other than economically. And what I say that to say, the South Africa is the proof that you can get rid of this, even because South Africa was far more brutal than the
Hmm.
United States. Their version of of fascism was very much modeled on American fascism and modeled on Jim Crow, but with excess brutality because of the numbers. South Africa was basically Mississippi because it had this overabundance of Blacks versus whites. And so to keep this large number of Black people down, most of whom were Kikuyu, were warriors. They had a warrior culture. And to keep them and the Xhosa down, they had to brutalize them. They had to kill millions of them. Same thing in the Congo. The Belgians they killed 10 million Congolese to keep them down so they could colonize them. The same thing in Namibia. The Germans killed millions of Namibians and put them in concentration camps as a test run before they put the Jews in concentration camps in Europe. So Europeans were very skilled at colonization and at brutality.
Hmm.
But they lost Namibia, they lost
Hmm.
South Africa,
Hmm.
they lost the Congo, they were driven out of Tanzania. Ultimately, this colonizer fascism loses. It
Yes.
loses its grip on the population because at a certain point, a majority decides they've had enough. Haiti was another version of this. And even in the 18th century, when Haitians had had enough, they used their numbers, they used their ingenuity, and they used their people power to overthrow the French colonizers. We can overthrow this regime. We don't have to violently overthrow it, but we can
Hmm.
rid ourselves of it. Because if
Yeah.
those other cultures can do it with far fewer resources, far less money, the Chinese repelled us in Korea.
Right.
Remember, these
Right.
were the poor, supposed peasants of China. We
Right.
went at them in the 1960s when we were the technological superior, and they mushed us.
Listen, we
We
won't even,
couldn't
we
beat
don't have,
Vietnam.
we don't, I was about to say, we don't have time to talk about Vietnam, but I spent several weeks in Vietnam and I was like, this place is amazing. But my first day there, I was like, what made America think that they could roll up to this country in this time over these decades? So that'll have to be another Zoom or another conversation. Maybe we should
We
just
can
write
win.
something
But I
together.
think the beautiful thing about it is we
We,
can win. But you have to
right.
start. I used to be, and very quickly I'll say this. I know I'm too wordy, but here's the reality. I used to be a press secretary, right? When I
Hmm.
quit the news because I was I despised George W. Bush and that war in Iraq. I quit and I became a press secretary. I went through Wellstone action training, similar to Mike Waltz.
Hmm.
He
Hmm.
did it 2 years after I did. And I worked in that 2004 election. And what I learned as a press secretary is the first person you have to spin in order to do spin is spin yourself. You have to
Hmm.
believe you can win or you can't win. If a basketball team goes on the court not believing they can win, they can't win. You know, my kids
Right,
used to play
right,
soccer. The way that they used to hype them up is they had to believe they could win. No
right.
matter if they were smaller than the other team, weaker than the other team, if they didn't have as many shooters as the other team. We on the sidelines, the moms used to hype our kids up. I remember we had a team one year, our kids played, they didn't play travel soccer. They played, you know, the kind of soccer that's not as high stakes.
Hmm.
And and our kids would go from being on the best team to the worst team. One year, our middle son Jamar was on the worst team in the league. They were like zero. Ended up winning one game. They lost every game. There were sometimes they wanted to forfeit because they were losing so badly. But that last game of the season, the moms all gathered on one side, and our plan was we always hype the kids up, but this time we
Hmm.
were so extra. We were so extra that if the kids barely kicked the ball, we would go nuts, right? We were going crazy. We had these kids so convinced. It was like a Lord of the Rings moment.
Yeah,
And when I tell you,
Jedi mind tricks.
we Jedi mind tricked these kids, and they won the game. And they won the game 1-0.
Hmm.
They got one
That's
goal.
all. But hey, guess what? All you
But that's
need
all it
is
took.
one.
And
That's all you need is one.
each kid did something extraordinary. One kid, our kid popped up a goal where he stopped the goal. There was this one very heavy kid who never did anything much. He never got to play. He went and he's booted the ball once and he passed it. We went crazy for this kid. And they won the game. And what I will say that to say is that you could be the sorriest team, the
Mhm.
smallest team, the littlest team, the weakest team, and you can be up against monsters. But if
Right,
you believe you can win,
right.
you can win.
Well, and also, we all have a role to play,
Yes.
right? I tell people all the time, I've aged out of door knocking, like when it comes to, helping. I was like, hey, listen, I'll buy the pizza though, because there was a point in time where I couldn't afford the pizza. I could only
Right.
door knock, right?
That's right.
But now it's like, hey, listen, I'm a little older. I'll buy the pizza for the volunteers.
That's
Okay,
it.
so I could talk to you forever.
Yes.
We got 2 minutes left. You are just, I know people miss you terribly. Can you just remind them where they can see your brilliance, where they can read your brilliance? I just, do you have any final words to help people stay motivated and inspired as we continue this fight? And lastly, tell us a bit more about the State of the People tour.
Yes. So I am going on the State of the I'm part of the State of the People tour. Christina, we're getting you involved in going on stops too. We're going to 10 cities starting in the capital of Black America, Atlanta, Georgia. And we are going to go to 10 different cities, and we're not going in for any partisan purpose or to tell people to register to vote. No, the purpose is to ask communities, what do you need? How can
Mhm.
we help? And to hype people up to believe they could win. There's a Hit Strategies has done some really important data showing that Black people have never felt so disempowered in decades because of the 2004 election. 2024 election. We're going into these communities to say, do not feel disempowered, feel hopeful, and find your joy. And that is my advice to everyone. Find your joy, not just me joy, which
I
you
was
can
about to say,
find at
that's a
Joy.
double entendre, and I love it.
It is. You can find me at joyannreid.com. So you can find joy that way. And that's where I will tell you all the other places I'll be, including the places on the tour where I'll be showing up, but also my next steps. I've got some exciting new stuff that I'm doing in the next month, especially the month of June. Mark June on your calendars. I got something
Okay.
big coming up, but I will announce all of that on joyannreid.com and on my podcast with Jackie Reed, Read This, Read That. So if you follow those two things, you will find out all the good stuff I'm doing. But if you can join us on that tour, it's called State of the People. You can find it at stateoftheppl.com.
Ugh, I miss you. Just know anything you need, the answer is yes. Just
Got you. Don't
whatever
threaten
it
me
is.
with a
It's
good
like,
time. I'm going to be calling you. Guess what I need?
I want to thank all of our attendees. I know that you all have been just fortified seeing Joy again. Thank you so much for supporting Fair Fight. Please be sure to look on our website to make sure you stay involved. And we have more events coming up with other brilliant women to talk about politics and policy and the way forward. So, Joy, much appreciated. I shall see you soon. And I want to
Yes.
thank Eva and Nancy, who are also coordinators to Nancy Koziel is the board chair of Fair Fight Action. And yeah, thank you. We shall see you soon.
Thank you. Love y'all.
Night
Thanks
night.
for bye.